Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing Last of the Mohicans by Shigeru Sugiura. Now, if you haven't guessed from the title, Last of the Mohicans, this is an adaptation of the James Fenimore Cooper novel, Last of the Mohicans. Just before I, start talking about the manga itself, I just want to briefly touch on, the company that published this, which was Picture Box. Basically, Picture Box set up an imprint, 10-cent manga, and the idea of it was to release manga that was, heavily, for one it was old, like old manga, and the other was that it was heavily influenced by American pop culture. But they only got 2 releases out, Last of the Mohicans being the first, and Osamu Tezuka's Mysterious Underground Men being the second, out before they, went bankrupt. So all we got was those 2 releases, which is a shame because there could have been some really, really interesting manga released under that branch. But with that said, let's have a little discussion about, the actual quality of the manga that I'm holding right now. So, Last of the Mohicans, what is the story about? It's set during colonial time America, and there is a war being fought between the French and English, with the help of some Native American allies on either side. Now, our lead character is a character called Hawkeye, also known as the Carabine Kid, who is a spy in the... he's a British spy, and he's been spying on the French. And he's returning to a British fort when he comes across a bunch of Native Americans. There's 2 tribes, the Mohicans and there is the Mingo. And the Mingo have wiped out all of the Mohicans except for 2 of them. The Carabine Kid rescues them and takes them back to the fort. The fort is then, attacked by the French and their Native American allies. But Le Carabine Kid is able to help drive them back. And afterwards he's given the task of transporting the 2 daughters of a very important general. That is, the main plot of the story. First thing I want to point out is that this is a very short manga. This is only 114 pages long. So, with that said, that causes a couple of issues for me. It feels kind of rushed. It feels almost like bullet points of the original story. There is kind of like the characters themselves are very underdeveloped and kind of one-dimensional. And actually, for example, there was a kind of a priest, a preacher that joined them. And besides the fact that we saw him help them in a couple of their plans and fighting off some people, we hardly see that preacher. We don't know anything about him. He feels like a very unnecessary character, and I suspect he was like an important character in the original novel, but in this he just comes off as being completely unnecessary, which is kind of disappointing. And the story itself feels very rushed, as I said before, which is disappointing. But that said, Shigeru was well known for being a gag artist or gag mangaka in general, and the gags themselves work very well here. I wasn't roaring laughing, but I was having a good chuckle every so often. Like, for example, there was a bit where the 2 girls are captured by the Mingo, and there was a kind of a heavyish girl assigned to guard them, and she says to them, don't try running away because I'm a heavy sleeper. And I'm kind of wondering to myself, if you're a heavy sleeper, doesn't that make it really easy for them to run away? And then the very next panel you see that she's lying down, sleeping on a blanket, and she has a rope tied around the 2 girls, and 2 girls are looking at each other going, we're going to need something to cut this rope because she is a heavy sleeper. She's really, really heavy. Which, I found very funny, it's a pun. And, I was chuckling at that. And then there's a couple of other scenes, there's a bit where Le Carabine Kid, sneaks into a French fort, and there's a kind of he kind of reminded me of Fatty Arbuckle a bit, this kind of guard, who, you know, he's given wine and he's just kind of like complaining and giving out, and he starts, you know, getting a little violent. And I thought that was quite an amusing little scene as well. So in general, to do with the story, the main story itself didn't really do much for me, like characters-wise or story itself. But the gags were definitely very funny, and I could see why he was known as being a very, very talented gag artist. Now, the artwork is what a lot of people talk about when it comes to this manga, because this manga is really, really strange, I should say, when it comes to its artwork. The author himself was known for these kind of very, almost kind of a hallucinogenic, like psychedelic art. And I could definitely see that from here. So the first 2 pages is kind of like among the most consistent in his art style. As you can see, it's this kind of art, you know, pleasant backgrounds, you know, decent character designs. And but then, for some reason, very next page, there's an insanely detailed picture of one of the Mingo. Which actually kind of reminds me of the Gikiga artwork that was coming out at the time. You know, I look at that and I kind of think to myself, slightly Lone Wolf from Cobb, you know, the artwork of Goseki Kojima. And then you cut to another part, and as you can see, all of a sudden the characters are like insanely, you know, cartoony looking. And it's really weird. Like, in fact, sometimes they even like mix in the same panel, like, you know, right up here at the top. You have a kind of a, you know, more realistic looking kind of Native American, you know, alongside this really, really weird cartoony looking priest. So, kind of crazy. And it's definitely a very weird looking manga from that perspective. Now, in general, I like the artwork. You know, a lot of the character designs are very pleasant, very nice. There's a good amount of detail in the background, and the staging is very nice. But I will say that some of the character designs for the more cartoony looking characters don't exactly do anything for me. I just find them a bit too, I don't know, ugly, I should say. Like, for example, the characters at the very bottom here. Like, I just don't like the proportions of the, you know, characters, you know, like huge mouths, and then like the head that goes up, or, you know, really like, you know, large skull with a tiny mouth or whatever. I just find those bits, like those character designs, to be ugly. But in general, I like the artwork. I will say that. Now, with that said, what do I think of this manga? I liked it. I enjoyed it. The gags. But I can't imagine myself going back to this as much as I will be going back to, say, Mysterious Underground Men. I find Mysterious Underground Men, despite being released well over 20 years, or 30 years, 20 years, like 25 years I think might have been the dates between them, before Last of the Mohicans, I find it to be a more accomplished work in terms of, you know, storytelling and, you know, character development, etc, etc. With this, I just find it kind of very light and kind of, I don't know, kind of unfulfilling, but I do like the gags, I will say. Now, from the actual edition itself, it was, you know, a Tencent manga. And what does that mean? First of all, hardcover. Very nice hardcover. You know, it's nice and thick and feels very comfortable in your hand. So, from that perspective, definitely it works very well. Then the trim size is something that I was a bit surprised at when I got this. The previous Tencent manga I got was Mysterious Underground Men. And I was expecting Last of the Mohicans to be that size, but, you know, just simply look at, you know, the sheer size difference between them. It's just insane. And I remember, like, for a moment I was kind of confused as to why there was such a dramatic difference. And then I remembered the whole purpose of Tencent manga, like one big part of it was to release manga as it was originally released. So, for example, this was released as a standalone, you know, book back in the 40s. So I guess it makes sense that it would be like a kind of a standard, or even smaller, like kind of tankobon size. Whereas this was, I'd say, serialized in a magazine. So I'm assuming then that they decided to go with the magazine's trim size. And besides that, there's a couple of other things I want to talk about this edition. One, I guess, in part of, you know, keeping the visual look of it very similar to how it was originally released. The blacks are ever so slightly purple. I'm not sure if you guys can see that, but there is a slight tinge of purple in all of the blacks in this manga, which definitely contributes to a different look in comparison to other manga. Definitely I do appreciate that in keeping to like the similarity with the original release of the manga. And then the last thing I guess I should talk about is the essay written by Ryan Holmberg at the end. Actually, there's two things I guess I should point out. One is actually a kind of an interview done with Shigeru Sugiura about silent movies and the influence of movies on him when he was growing up. So that's first, and then you have the essay by Ryan Holmberg. And the essay is very entertaining. There's a lot of great information about, you know, the influences of, you know, for example, the Gekiga manga that was being released around the time of this, and also the, you know, the influence of Western cinema and Western novels, etc., etc. But I will say that, you know, just this is obviously a biased point. I was less interested in the essay in this in comparison to the essay he did for Mysterious Underground Men. That's simply because I'm really interested in Osamu Tezuka, so of course I was going to be more interested in, you know, the Mysterious Underground Men essay than I was in this. So I was, at certain points while I was reading that essay, I was kind of like drifting off, but then, you know, there's always some, you know, very interesting pieces of information that I, you know, really found fascinating. The only other thing I will point out about this is that in comparison to the essay in Mysterious Underground Men, where it's placed at the back and you know, start at the back and you read, you know, from left to right like you would normally, for some reason the essays actually start right after the end of the manga itself. And I'll just describe how you read it. You start out on the left page, as you would expect. You read down this way, but then you turn from right to left, next page, and then you start on the opposite page again. So it's very weird. You know, for a moment I was, for a good while actually, I was trying to figure out how to read it. So I found that kind of uncomfortable, but, you know, it is a good essay overall. So, in conclusion, Last of the Mohicans, what do I think of it? It is an okay manga, I will say. I wasn't keen on the story, I wasn't keen on the characters, but the gags and the art definitely got me through it and kept me entertained. But I can't imagine myself going back to this in the same way that I would go back to, say, Mysterious Underground Men. You know, I think Mysterious Underground Men is a better work, it's more influential on manga, etc., etc. But I definitely did find, you know, the essay produced with this very enlightening. And also it's a beautiful edition, as you can imagine. It is the one of only 2 editions of Tencent manga. So if you're into historical manga, you know, like manga that has had a big influence on, you know, the manga medium, there's really no reason why you shouldn't get your hands on this. The only thing that would have probably been better is if they had released the more influential 1953 Last of the Mohicans adaptation that he did. But I can understand after reading the essay why they chose to translate this, because the amount of American influence on this edition is far greater than it was in the original manga. So yeah, so overall I'll recommend this to people who are into historical manga, but to anyone else I'd just probably say give it a skip. If you have to get one of the Tencent manga editions, I would recommend Mysterious Underground Men over this. So, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.